In the sixth lesson, we're going to look at Paul's warnings regarding the Judaizers and their false teachings regarding godly suffering. If you remember from the last lesson, Paul introduces his own disposition toward his circumstances, his sufferings. And in this section of Colossians 2, as we move into the second chapter, verses 1 through 5, we're also going to look at the book of Luke, chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. From the very beginning of the nation of Israel, many of the Hebrews made this error in theology, in their thinking, that material blessing and material prosperity must be indicative of a strong spirituality. And it really stems out of this really errant misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy is a very important book, not just for the Old Testament, for the New Testament. Paul will deal with a lot of how Deuteronomy 28 is interpreted in other letters. And from the very beginning, what Paul understands correctly is that one's spirituality has been based only on one's alignment with God's Word. Again, the idea that God gives you stuff if you do well and keep the law is an errant misunderstanding of the law's purpose and what is written in Deuteronomy 28. And you see this, how just starkly this contrasts Paul's own view based on what he's just said in the previous verses that we looked at in the last lesson, where Paul is embracing his suffering to carry the gospel to the Gentiles. He sees it as necessary. And he thus encourages his audience. This is very interesting. He encourages his audience to be encouraged by his struggle. And any wealth that is to be obtained comes from, as he says, the full assurance of understanding, resulting in a true knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ. So it's a categorically different system of encouraging someone in their faith. And what we're going to see when we look at Luke chapter 5 is how the Pharisees demonstrate their errant understanding of the Old Covenant and the purpose it serves, because they begin to question Jesus regarding his relationship to the outcast. And his response, it refers to his function as the suffering Messiah, as related in Isaiah 61, and as a minister of God's grace and mercy to those who recognize their need. The Old Covenant has rightly condemned these outcasts who recognize their sin and who come to Jesus aware of their need for mercy. But the Pharisees, who see themselves as righteous, don't believe they need righteousness. They already have it by virtue of keeping the law. They are not condemned by the law. They keep the law. And so they don't see themselves as needing this mercy. And the Gentiles must therefore get on board with the keeping of the law. If the outcast wants to come in, they have to keep the law. They have to do what the Pharisees do before they can have righteousness. And the new covenant, which Paul ministers in the aftermath of Jesus' death and resurrection, it provides mercy for those who are condemned under the Old Covenant. It rightly understands the Old Covenant not as a means to attaining righteousness, but as the thing that condemns the unrighteous, including the Gentiles. And the deluders of this message, these Judaizers, are coming into the churches and they're teaching that Paul's sufferings and his apparent lack of material blessing are the evidence that his message is not compatible with the law. They say, well, how do we know he's teaching the wrong things? Well, look at his situation. He's thrown into prison. He doesn't have anything. He's not been here to see you. It's clear evidence that he's not keeping the law because he's being punished for it. And in other words, they are pointing to the fact that Paul has not made it to the Colossians because he's ashamed of his false teachings, and they point to his suffering as evidence that he is a false teacher. However, Paul makes it clear in what he talks about in the last lesson and in this lesson that writing this letter is done in large part to correct this misunderstanding. In fact, he sees his sufferings as not as evidence that he's not doing the right thing, but as the exact opposite. That not only is he doing right by following the example of Christ in his sufferings, it's because of his sufferings that the gospel is going forth, and he considers that worth it.